So let's start with a really big question. What if a path to peace in Ukraine wasn't just missed, but what if it was deliberately blocked? It's a heavy thought, right? Well, today we're going to dive into a very specific, very pointed narrative that makes exactly that claim. We're going to break down how this whole stab-in-the-back theory is put together piece by piece based on the material we're looking at.
And there it is, right there. A US policy/NATO ruler stab in the back. I mean, that phrase is incredibly powerful, and it's really the heart of this whole argument. The idea here isn't just that peace efforts failed. No, it's that they were actively betrayed. That's the core accusation, and everything we're about to look at is designed to support that one single idea.
Okay, so what does that actually mean in practice? Well, the core allegation is that a real potential peace process was on the table in early 2022, but it was deliberately sabotaged. The argument is that a path to peace existed right at the very start, and someone intentionally blocked it. So let's dig in and see how the source material connects the dots to get to such a really serious conclusion. All right, so our first piece of this puzzle is about a peacemaker who wasn't, and it centers on the story of Gerhard Schroeder. The whole narrative really kicks off with him. He's not just presented as some politician, but as the potential peacemaker, the one guy who is in a unique position to mediate.
So according to this telling of events, the whole peace effort was actually kicked off by Ukraine. We're talking early March 2022. President Zelenskyj himself supposedly reached out to Schroeder. And why him? Well, it's because he was banking on Schroeder's famous, or maybe infamous, connections to Vladimir Putin to try and end what the source we're looking at calls a US policy NATO proxy war.
And this is where the narrative really presents a huge contradiction. On one hand, you have Schroeder, the supposed peacemaker, asked by Zelenskyj to mediate. But at the exact same time, he's being painted as a target back in Germany. The source points to a specific call on March 21st from a German politician demanding sanctions against Schroeder. Get this, for the exact same Russia connections that made him the perfect mediator in the first place. The timing is presented as anything but a coincidence. It's framed as a direct hit, an attempt to blow up the whole peace process before it could even get going.
Okay, so to really build this case, the narrative doesn't just stick to 2022. Nope, it goes back in time, way back. It tries to connect the dots with history to argue that what happened isn't a one-off thing, but part of a much, much longer pattern.
And this timeline is really the backbone of that historical argument. Look at the dots it connects. We start in 2003 with Angela Merkel supporting the Iraq War, which was, against her own government's official stance. Then we jump to 2014 and the Maidan massacre in Kyiv. Fast forward to 2016, and a study comes out that completely reframes who was responsible for that massacre. And finally, all of this is presented as the historical context for the 2022 escalation. The key takeaway here is that the source doesn't see these as separate events. It sees them as a chain, one leading directly to the next.
So let's start with that first dot on the timeline, back in 2003. The pattern, according to this narrative, begins right here. You have Chancellor Schroeder's government officially opposing the Iraq War. But then, the opposition leader at the time, Angela Merkel, writes an article for the Washington Post supporting it. This moment gets flagged as a big deal. The German media at the time even called it kowtowing to Bush. And for the source, this is Exhibit A, the first piece of evidence showing a major German political faction siding with U.S. foreign policy, even when it went against their own government.
All right, the second historical pillar here is the Maidan massacre. This is an absolutely pivotal moment in the story, and the source we're looking at relies on a very, very specific interpretation of it. It points to a 2016 study that came to a pretty explosive conclusion, that the violence wasn't from government forces, but from what the study calls the Western-backed opposition. You can see why this is so important to the narrative, right? This reframing is absolutely crucial for the argument that Western influence has been a destabilizing force in Ukraine for a long, long time.
And that brings us right up to the edge, to February 2022. The stage is set. We're now just days before the full-scale invasion. The source zooms right in on the Munich Security Conference, and it paints this event as the final showdown, the moment where these two completely different visions for the future just clashed head-on.
And you can just feel the tension in the air. Picture this. Outside the conference, you've got protesters chanting, "Stop the war course of the NATO states." Okay? Then you go inside and you hear Germany's new chancellor, Olaf Scholz, saying very diplomatic things like, "No country should be the backyard of another." Sounds peaceful, right? But then, and this is the key contrast for the source, the incoming chairman of the conference, Christoph Hausken, gets up and explicitly calls to send weapons to Ukraine. 3 completely different messages, all at the same event.
So, what's the takeaway from this moment according to the source? It's pretty clear. It's that you have this public face of peace in diplomacy, but behind the scenes, there's a powerful push for war. The argument is that Scholz's words were just rhetoric, while the real decision, the push for military escalation, was already happening. For this narrative, the Munich Security Conference was the moment it all came to a head, the point of no return where the war course officially took over.
So, we've seen the historical context, we've seen the key moments leading up to the conflict, and now the narrative takes its final step. It moves from just describing events to pointing fingers. We're about to get a list of the accused, the people the source labels as warmongers.
And the allegation here is incredibly direct. It's severe. The source claims that a specific list of German politicians weren't just watching from the sidelines. No, it alleges they were fully aware of the planned stab in the back, and were actually complicit in the whole plan to sabotage the peace efforts we talked about earlier.
And here's the list as presented in the source material. It names 8 prominent conservative German politicians: Merz, Söder, Wadepool, Dobrindt, Frey, Wüst, Rhein, and Hart, all from the CDU and CSU parties. The narrative doesn't mince words. It labels them warmongers and accomplices, and flat out alleges they were all in on the plan to kill the peace process.
Okay, so let's just quickly recap the entire story we've just unpacked. It goes like this. You have a viable peace effort, kicked off by Ukraine and led by Gerhard Schroeder. That effort is then intentionally undermined by what the source calls pro-NATO forces. And this is the really critical part, this act of sabotage is framed not as some random event, but as the predictable finale to a historical pattern that's been playing out for almost 20 years.
And that really brings us to the big question to leave you with. How does connecting seemingly unrelated events create such a powerful narrative? We've just walked through a very specific viewpoint, right? We've seen how it takes a newspaper article from 2003, a study from 2016, a conference in 2022, and weaves them together to build a story that feels, consistent and powerful. It really makes you think about how these narratives are built, and maybe more importantly, what it is that makes them so persuasive to some people.